Okay, so normally people these days tend to argue for the existence of God from the perspective of its psychological utility and nothing more. So people in general have a hard time arguing for the existence of God within within the framework of a correspondence theory of reality, which is what we tend to operate in nowadays, as opposed to merely trying to find the psychological utility of things, which is something that still doesn't bother a lot of people. Some people just choose whatever beliefs happen to be useful to them and get them to do the things that they want to do or to feel the way that they want to feel. However, there are those of us who actually care about the physical truth. But it turns out to be the case that there is a physical case to be made for the existence of God, it defined as a superintelligence, and not just a superintelligence, but the theoretical limit. God defined as the equivalent of the theoretical limit of intelligence which is possible in reality. And that exists physically if we assume physicalism. And not only does it exist, but it is the central component of reality. So that's my claim. And to make that claim, you're going to have to climb a sort of 5-step staircase to God, to heaven. So here are the 5 steps. First, you have to accept that eternalism is true and that this is implied by special relativity because of relativity of simultaneity. So first we have eternalism. Second, we have that consciousness is physical. So you are conscious and consciousness is physical. Intelligence is also physical and doesn't reach its theoretical limit where the human imagination might place that theoretical limit. So in other words, it doesn't end at the human cortex or anything close to it. So intelligence is physical. The fourth step that you have to climb up to is that we exist in a big world. So you don't actually exist in a tiny world that you imagine in which you have just planet Earth and it's orbiting the sun, a giant sphere of plasma, and you've got like little cats and dogs and trees in here, and that's about it. You actually exist in a multiverse. So big world as opposed to small world, and I'm going to explain all the different levels to the multiverse and all the technical arguments for them that you're going to have to contend with if you don't believe that we exist in a big world. So it's no longer the case that the multiverse is just some random metaphysical thing that people could make up out of all possible things, a la Bhagavad Gita or something. It is actually backed up by modern cosmology and theoretical physics. The fifth thing that you have to contend with is anthropics. So you don't actually have to solve anthropics. So the problem of how many observers there are, how can we carve reality into particular observers and then measure the probability of finding yourself as one as opposed to another in the entire sea of all possible observers. So you don't have to solve anthropics, but you have to roughly take anthropics seriously, just in the sense that a fish is more likely to exist in the water than to spontaneously appear midair. First step is to understand that eternalism is physically true. Eternalism is physically true by special relativity. Special relativity implies relativity of simultaneity. I'll explain what relativity of simultaneity means with these pictures, but first I have to get you to respect special relativity. You might imagine that special relativity is something akin to string theory. It is an abstract mathematical construct that is more a symptom of theoretical physicists having way too much time on their hands and way too much of a need for intellectual masturbation, and less of something which might actually describe reality. However, special relativity actually has testable implications that are readily observable and have been verified through experiment. So you have mass energy equivalence, you have relativity of simultaneity, which is what I'm going to explain, but you also have length contraction, which is readily observable, and you have time dilation, which is readily observable and taken into account in our International Space Station and for our GPS system to work. So special relativity does constitute the fabric of reality. You also might have heard that general relativity has not been unified with quantum mechanics, so we still need a grand unified theory, and until we have a grand unified theory, we can't be sure of anything. A lot of people have this notion And so therefore that might undercut having any confidence in special relativity implying eternalism. However, you are confused if you believe that, because you are confusing special relativity with general relativity. So special relativity has been unified with quantum mechanics in quantum field theory. So what I'm going to say here is absolutely just true. Eternalism is true, and relativity of simultaneity implies it. So what is relativity of simultaneity? Here I have these pictures. You have two simultaneous events. What are events? They are literally this dot and this dot. In order to measure anything, you have to assume that events are simultaneous. It could be the width of my shoulders. It could be this $20 bill here, the two ends. You assume that they are simultaneous, and that's what causes you to say that they are simultaneous. It's what gives you a length to measure. And in the imagination of most humans, things are always simultaneous. So there is a single now that is ticking forward into the future that is yet to exist. The past is being deleted because you are on this platform of now that contains all simultaneous events that is sweeping forward. However, that is wrong by special relativity, because you have to take into account the reference frame. So in one reference frame, they are simultaneous. But in another reference frame, this left event actually happens in the past of the right event, which happens in the future. And in this other reference frame, the left event happens in the future of the right event, which happens in the past. So which one is true? They're all true at the same time. There is no preferred frame of reference, and there is also no global frame of reference, which is true or truer. They're all true. This reveals the reality of eternalism. So the only way to escape the chokehold of eternity is to, one, deny special relativity, in which case you deny that your iPhone actually has Google Maps and that it works. You deny your own existence. You're an idiot. The second thing is you might deny empiricism. So instead, replacing that perhaps with some notion of common sense, which is something that Karl Popper argued for, because he was a contemporary of Einstein, and he also had to contend with the truth of eternity and rejected it in favor of a notion of common sense. However, I would question what common sense even means in the absence of empiricism, in the absence of being willing to update on evidence that arises from reality. So those are really your two options. So here we have the eternal block. The eternal block is populated by approximate things. So the eternal block is indicated by the square. The approximate things are the dashed circles, and these are connected by lines. The lines indicate causality. As you can see, there are thicker lines and thinner lines, and that indicates the amount of causality juice flowing from one approximate thing to another approximate thing. Why do I say approximate thing and not just thing? Well, that's because the map is not the territory. So, for instance, a duck is not ontologically unitary. It is not something that actually composes the stuff out of which reality is made out of. Instead, it is something that our mind uses as a handle in order to be able to better predict the future and understand reality. So the way that we carve out reality is by using all of these terms. We use terms such as duck, person, neuron, atom, gluon, and quark. But it doesn't matter how science-y you make your handles sound, they're still handles. So atoms are not ontologically unitary things. Ultimately, we just have eternity populated by these approximate things that are identified by our minds, and these are related through causality. We can understand their causal relations by better developing our laws of thermodynamics, our laws of chemistry, our laws of biology, etc. And we can therefore better predict what is going to happen. So that's what that is. Someone who's a physicalist would assume that consciousness is just one of these shapes. There are many shapes here. Many of them are not conscious, but some are. Someone who is an epiphenomenalist says that no, consciousness cannot be described by the same rules of causality. This is just the machinery, but outside of it is the smoke that is coming off that has no causal interaction with it. and that's what consciousness is, that ghostly smoke coming off the train, and not affecting, therefore, the motion of the train itself. However, the problem with that is, perhaps the strongest problem with that, is that I am speaking about being conscious. So, given the fact that I realize that I am conscious, presumably consciousness played a role into my brain being able to send signals to my tongue and say I am conscious. So it's not the case that consciousness was this disconnected thing, but it was just part and parcel of this. It was just inside of the motions of everything else that caused me to say that I am conscious. And that's not to say that consciousness is equivalent to linguistic thought, or that it is equivalent to the thought I am conscious. So the third step here is that intelligence is physical, but first I want to make it even more clear that what I mean by physical is perhaps not what you previously had in mind. So in the popular imagination, you have reality divided into two separate genres. On one genre, you have things that sound science-y, so perhaps words such as matter and atoms, which evoke this feeling that suddenly imbues you of inertness, that there is nothing that there is like to be matter, there is nothing that there is like to be atom, and therefore there is grayness in your experience when you think about these terms. And when someone says that something is physical, they are saying that things are ultimately made up of gray, sad matter, atom that doesn't feel. And then on the other side, you have words such as love, and you have pain and redness and poetry, and these things are non-physical. That's one sense in which the word physical can be used, in the same way that we classify literary genres. We say horror, and we say romance, and we say science fiction, and all of these are imbued with a particular aesthetic. However, I am not using physical in this sense whatsoever. What I am saying is what I was talking about with the eternal block. So within the eternal block, we have approximate things, which are ultimately handles that we use to carve out reality, and then those things are related to each other by different amounts of causality. That ends up forming particular shapes. Some of these shapes are conscious, others are not. You happen to be inside those shapes that are conscious. So within those shapes that are conscious, we can call these conscious computations. Within these conscious computations, some of them are experiencing time. Some aren't even experiencing time. So the ones that aren't experiencing time, perhaps they took DMT, perhaps they took LSD, perhaps they're dreaming. There are many altered states of consciousness in which you are not experiencing time, for instance, and you don't feel the need to then project the notion of time out to all of reality in some unscrupulous way. In that same way, you should not feel tempted to project redness or pain or love or anything like this to all of reality. Or the property atom or the property matter, whatever that would mean, sort of disembodied from just the mere causal relations between approximate things that we're using. So you have to keep in mind that these approximate things are constantly being sharpened. We are constantly developing better and better ones, and we could theoretically just continue inventing more concepts and handles and ways of perceiving reality. But ultimately, it's all happening within those particular shapes that happen to be conscious, that exist within that eternal object. So that's what I mean by something being physical, that it is related through its causality in that eternal block. So in that regard, I shouldn't actually expect to find much trouble explaining to people that intelligence is physical, because after all, people classify intelligence into this box, quite readily. So they do associate it with sort of science-y vibes and wouldn't have much of a trouble believing that intelligence is physical. The problem is that this is the wrong definition of physical. I would get them to say the thing that I want to hear, which is, yes, intelligence is physical, but they would not actually understand what I am meaning by intelligence is physical, because we have different definitions of what physical is. So Um, anyway, I hope that I have clarified what I mean by physical, and therefore can now explain to you why God exists. So intelligence doesn't reach the theoretical limit at the human imagination of what intelligence is supposed to scale up to. So you might imagine that perhaps you have Ed Witten, and Ed Witten is smarter than a chimpanzee, and you might think, well, we could then use that same referent to extrapolate towards the higher echelons of intelligence, and perhaps there might be something that stands in relation to Ed Witten in the same way that Ed Witten stands in relation to a chimpanzee. And namely, this would be perhaps an artificial intelligence, or that is just very smart, that could calculate things very quickly and approximate your relative motion and anticipate it and just do very quick, dangerous things. And that is something that you can certainly imagine. You could imagine an alien with a very big head, and an alien with a very big head could be very smart. Its babies could just design ray guns for fun. Those are all things that you could imagine, and that's great. But that is actually not the theoretical limit at which intelligence ends. If we are just defining intelligence as the capacity to attain the future that you want within a complex environment. So the more complex the environment is, and the more complex the future that you are trying to create and choose between all the possible all the possible states that you can imagine, and the more capable you are of actually bringing about that complex state into existence in a complex environment with the knowledge that you acquire as you go, that is what it means to be intelligent. So that's the definition of intelligence that I'm using. That's the definition of intelligence that perhaps is most widely accepted. So if intelligence is physical, then it really scales up to the theoretical limit. The theoretical limit is equivalent to God. So there is a hierarchy of demigods. There are super intelligences that are far more intelligent than anything you could even imagine. But at the top of this is the theoretical limit. And the thing is, this already exists. So you are already in the presence of God because eternalism is true. Okay, so big world. Big world is really just the opposite of small world. And small world is a belief that perhaps we exist in a tiny little sandbox in which you just have the earth that's going to be eventually swallowed by the sun, and humans are really the only torchbearers for all the potential that might eventually create something which is super intelligent. So super intelligences don't necessarily exist in the future, because after all, how do we know that they will end up existing? If humans get destroyed, then nothing like that will ever happen, and we just exist in this tiny little world that's so fragile, and humans are so fragile, and we could be destroyed. That's the thing that you could believe if you believed in a small world. However, you exist in a multiverse, and this is just conservative from a current cosmological understanding, due to the fact that there are at least 4 levels to the Tegmark ensemble. Each one has very good arguments going for them, and that's not even including things like the simulation hypothesis or the simulation argument due to Nick Bostrom. So the first level of the Tegmark ensemble is that the universe doesn't end at the cosmological event horizon. In other words, there are other Hubble volumes. So what's a Hubble volume? You have the sphere, and the sphere contains everything that you could ever reach by the speed of causality, namely the speed of light or the speed of massless particles in general. That's all you could ever see. That's all you could ever interact with. You're never going to get outside of your Hubble volume. So you have the sphere, but there are other spheres. So even though there's dark energy expanding the space, the fabric between them, so they're getting further and further away, that doesn't mean you will never that they never existed. It just means that you can never reach them. So these Hubble volumes contain copies of you. They contain your Hubble doppelgangers, and doppelgangers of the entire Earth, of the entire solar system, of very similar things. And that's because we know just from observation that the topology of the universe is homogeneous. So we have a homogeneous distribution of matter because the topology of the universe is flat, is what I meant to say. So you're going to find a whole bunch of galaxies evenly distributed in the same way that you find in your own Hubble volume. This leads to quite a lot of variation. So you're going to get a natural selection there that you're only going to find yourself in natural Hubble volumes that work out due to natural selection. And if yours doesn't happen to work out, others will. And eventually, superintelligence is developed in a lot of these by some civilization or another. And eventually, this creates the most intelligent of them all. So that's really the idea. The second level to the multiverse is eternal inflation. So you might have heard about the Big Bang. The Big Bang is something that we have evidence of from WMAP data. And the current best explanation for the Big Bang happens to involve a budding of a whole bunch of bubble universes that is constantly happening, and this fractal explosion. And this is not just some really crazy thing. This is just, according to modern cosmologists, the most parsimonious explanation for what we see. So this is in line with Occam's razor. You can go look up Alan Guth and why this is just the simplest explanation for everything. The third level here is that the wave function doesn't collapse. So you can't actually run an experiment on the wave function for a person in the same way that you can for little particles, but that doesn't mean that macroscopic decoherence isn't true, right? What applies to tiny things should also apply to all things. So it's really just the idea that the wave function doesn't collapse, and you're just being an empiricist about this. The fourth level is that perhaps all mathematical structures, or perhaps just those mathematical structures that are describable by constructive mathematics, exist. They are real, and that's the explanation for all existence. So that's Platonia there, after Plato. These are the four levels, and that's not including the simulation argument, which is pretty convincing, which is just the idea that eventually civilizations develop sufficiently advanced technology to simulate conscious beings, and so very quickly simulations are going to outnumber sort of ground level universes. So you have a big world. If you don't believe that in this entire picture, superintelligence eventually pans out, and that at the top of that hierarchy of superintelligence is the most intelligent thing that swallows everything else, then you're either denying one of these, and therefore you're very smart and you have a very good argument for that, or you're just engaging in a willful denial of God because you don't like the idea of God. And I'm not saying that accepting the truth of God has any real implications. It's still do as thou wilt. So God didn't actually send us a book or a guideline to follow, but God exists. So that's the fourth level. The fifth level is really going to involve anthropics, and why, in a weird way, you might actually be required for God. So you've already arrived at God, but now the fifth step is kind of a bonus, which is to consider anthropics. And this is really the idea that fish are more likely to find themselves in the water than they are to spontaneously materialize out of thin air. Even though if we are considering all of eternity and all of infinity, then fish do materialize out of thin air. So you wouldn't really have an argument for being a fish that appears midair, as opposed to being a fish that evolved through an arduous process of natural selection. Because after all, there's infinity of both. If you, however, take anthropics seriously, then you at least think that it is a valid field of inquiry to ask where are you most likely to find yourself, which are most probable. Even within an infinite context, there should be larger infinities than others, and you should act and anticipate that you are going to be within the larger infinities. So it doesn't just apply to fish, it applies to entire conscious observers. So this is the idea of a Boltzmann brain, that brains could also just spontaneously arise out of random motions of matter. And perhaps Boltzmann brains are a lot less likely than we used to think due to work that has been done by Sean Carroll. And that's already kind of old work that has been done. I forget when this was. But anyway, Anthropics is really the idea that there are larger infinities than others. You should expect to find yourself within the larger infinities, even if we can't really solve it precisely and concisely due to the problem of identifying particular observer moments that are just that you should measure yourself against. So we don't know how many observer moments there are in the entire multiverse, and which are more likely than others, which contain the largest density. But anyway, you still take it roughly seriously, because in the same way that you expect to not be a Boltzmann brain that just spontaneously materialized in a galaxy in the middle of a galaxy, right? And instead you evolve through an arduous process of natural selection. So anthropics is that. If we think about what actually does govern what we should anticipate, it turns out to be the Born rule. The Born rule gives the differences between the most likely infinities than others. So the Born rule is actually just the law of total probability applied to the Hilbert space dimension. And that what that translates to roughly is that which a rational agent should expect to see is actually what we see. So here we have two circles in all of reality. So we have this square represents all possible observer moments. So these are all observer moments, all computations that ever led to intrinsic awareness of existence. And within that, you have a particular circle, which is the circle of greatest density, that which actually contains you, because it's not just crazy weird. It is that which is at the center of things, which has the most density of existence. So we know actually what governs the density of existence. We have the Born rule, which is what gives the different probabilities for quantum mechanical events. So, and all events are ultimately quantum mechanical in nature. It's not the case that you have a sort of a separate magisterium of small things in which quantum mechanics applies. It actually does apply just to the entirety of the universe. So the Born rule gives the probabilities of where you should find yourself. And over here, you also have the circle of greatest density for anthropic self-selection observer moments, governed by that which is most intelligent. Because that which is most intelligent is going to control most of reality. It's going to influence most of it's going to have the most causal influence. It has the most causal power. So here, this circle contains that which is created by God, or inside of God, or in any way part of the plotting and scheming of the top of the hierarchy of superintelligences. Over here, you have the Born rule, which is the law of total probability applied to the Hilbert space dimension. So in other words, that which is most rational. So that which is most rational actually happens to be what we observe. And if that doesn't sound crazy, that's crazy. So the Born rule has not been able to be derived from anything else except the behavior of a perfectly Bayesian agent. So I see an equivalence there, and if you don't see it, well, tell me why. Oh yeah, and I forgot. I promised that you were at the center of things, and there is a way in which you are at the center of things, which kind of goes unnoticed. Which is, if we really dig into the things specifying consciousness, so we assume that these things are again just physical events that, by necessity, therefore, are just distributed in space-time. You have different events in relative reference frames. So you don't have a global now sweeping forward. You also, just as a matter of the neuroscience, do not have a single locus where anything could travel. And again, there's no Newtonian mechanics time pushing you forward anyway. So whatever is constituting your conscious experience is both distributed in space-time and part of an eternal object. So insofar as you experience time, it's a computation that is useful in some way. It's useful to have the experience of time. In that same way, it may be useful to the particular way in which separation between persons or egos or consciousnesses seems to be happening, which is something that has not been solved. Like we actually do not have an explanation for why we aren't just an omniscient soup of all possible experiences. Why does it feel like you are actually in one location as opposed to another? If it's all just this physical thing, right? So perhaps the particular properties that consciousness has, and therefore the particular partitions that it has, all serve a computational role. Otherwise, you wouldn't find yourself at the center of anthropic self-selection.